All right, so what we've got going on with this next app is a custom view. So this is custom view number 5. And what he's going to do is, you see this view right here. This is the custom view that we're creating. And he's centered within some activity over here. And what we're going to do is I'm going to press on him. And while he's depressed, his count is going to go up. So when I press him again, it goes back down to 0, and then I can release, and he stops counting. So as long as he's pressed, the count is being updated at some regular intervals. So if I give it a short press, we get a short count, and if I give it a long press, we get a long count that's going up. So the question is, how do we do this? So again, what I've got over here is a main activity. I'm using an app compat activity. That's just good practice for backwards compatibility. The set content view, so this is our first 2 lines of on create over here. This loads the activity main resource file into the main view. So take a look at activity main. And we've got this guy is going to be centered. So here's the centering using the app namespace. We constrain him to the parents top and bottom start and end, which has the effect of putting him right in the middle over here. And then I give specifications for the width and the height. And I actually am able to place my custom class, a custom visible class, by using the package name dot class name. So I'm referencing it by com.example pccosa custom views, my new view, and I get the package name from up at the top over here. Remember, so at the start of every file, we have the package name. That package name also shows up in things like the Android manifest over here. So there's the package definition. So the package name is around in several places. But by virtue of activity main being loaded with set content view, all the constructors are going to be called for all of these GUI elements. So, a constructor for a constraint layout was called, and the constructors for this myNewView class was also called. When the constructor for the myNewView class was called, that set this guy up over here. So the myNewView with the context and attribute set. And we initialized a handler, and we initialized the setup paint. So what's sort of special about this guy is it's a custom view. But we're starting to get into a level of complexity that's consistent with what you might get when you have your own custom views that you're making over here. And how do you have these multiple components all inside of the same view, and how do you get them synchronized with each other? So there are certain things that are always done in a certain way, or maybe not always, but they tend to be done in a certain way, right? So you have your class member variables up here, again, using AOSP definitions. I have a private paint, and I have a private handler. The paint is the class that defines the characteristics that are used for drawing, and the handler is a class, that's used for running methods at some point in the future. So we're going to want to set up both of those. So I set up the handler. I have declared and instantiated him over here. So by the time the constructor is finished, and I set my initial count back to 0. Again, I could have said private int dem count is equal to 0, but this line really doesn't make a difference. And then I run this method setup paint. This setup paint method is my own personal method. This is not, it's not inherent to the class. It's convenient and it's useful, and it's something that we tend to do because when you define these paint objects and instantiate them, you tend to set up a lot of characteristics for them. You tend to set the color, whether or not to use anti-aliasing, and whether or not the fill is going to be a certain way. So this is just basic initialization stuff, and we only really need to do this once if the colors are going to persist. And then for like drawing rectangles, we could have this guy filled over here. So this gets called again. This setup paint gets called by the constructor when our class is actually first made. And then all of this other stuff is going to be called at some point in the future. And really the deal with Android is knowing when these events are going to be called. You need to synchronize this dance of things that are going to get called and that happen. And the way you write your methods, your indentation, giving yourself comments that are clear and help you, that's going to make your code a lot more legible. It's going to make it a lot easier to read. So onTouchEvent is a method that's part of all views, and this is something that Android system, because this is a view, will make sure gets called when the user touches the screen. So when I touch the screen, here I'm touching it with my mouse because this is a virtual device, but when I touch the screen, this motion event is getting called. And that event is going to be passed in the event that's associated with this. So like it's going to have the X and Y position, whether or not it's a down or up is going to be available through get action. And I just make some determination based on the type of action over here. This should look familiar. I set the background color when we press down, and we reset the background color to blue when we release. What we're going to do when the action goes down, so when this button gets pressed, I run a method over here called start counting. And so let's take a quick jump down to start counting. So start counting over here, this method gets called when the button is pressed down after we've set that background to pink, right? So as soon as the background gets pink, then all of a sudden, boom, we make a single call to start counting. mCount is initialized, or it's reinitialized to 0, and then mHandler is told to post delayed. So it's important that by this point in time, the mHandler has already been initialized. Okay, we're gonna use the same handler multiple times over the course of this app. And what the handler again is going to do is the handler says, okay, run some method in the future. Actually, the method you're going to run in the future is the method called run inside of the class object that's defined here. And you're going to run that in 50 milliseconds, right? So tell the handler to run some method in the future. It's going to be the run method in the class that's defined at this point in 50 milliseconds. So remember that the word this in Java refers to the current class. And this method is a member of the MyNewView class, which extends view, but it's also implementing runnable. So because this guy is implementing runnable, and because we're not getting errors about this, that says to me that it's got a correctly defined method named run inside of here. So yeah, so here's our run. So to be clear, this is the class method run for this, right? This being the current class, which is to say the mHandler is going to run this method in 50 milliseconds. So 50 milliseconds after I press the button, boom, we're in run. And the first thing we do is we call increment and update. So increment and update makes the count go up by 1. And then it calls post invalidate. Recall that post invalidate means that the current display is invalid. So hey Android, when you're ready for this, call onDraw again. So as soon as Android can, it calls onDraw, which gets the value of count. Remember that mCount was just incremented over here. So it gets the value of count. It uses the mPaint object. It determines the size of that, determines the size of the canvas. So the canvas is passed to onDraw. And it displays this text, the displaced text, in the center using this X position and Y position, using the mPaint to draw this. So when the button is released, boom, we're in onTouch event, we're in action up, stop counting is called. Stop counting tells the handler, stop counting tells the handler to remove all the callbacks from the class method defined here. So this being a runnable, whatever the runnable is here. So this, it says, okay, we're gonna remove the run method over here. Okay, so what does this look like again? Let's take a look. So onTouch event triggers it off. OnTouch event, we get an action down. The action down set us to pink, and we started counting. Action down set us to pink, and we started counting, which means in start counting, we take our count and we reset it back to 0. We tell the handler, who is instantiated up in the when the view was created, to run some runnable. In this case, this is runnable 50 milliseconds in the future. 50 milliseconds after start counting is called, we arrive in run. So this method was queued up to run 50 milliseconds in the future by this statement. 50 milliseconds later, we increment an update. So we increment our count. We tell the view that the current view is invalid. So, hey, onDraw gets called, which is what is putting the number inside of here. And then notice that mHandler, this is self-referential kind of in a way, like it's telling the handler, hey, run the runnable in the class defined here. In this case, this is the parent class in 50 milliseconds. So we get into this loop where this run method is telling itself to run itself 50 milliseconds in the future over and over and over again. We keep going. And then this is going to happen as long as this button is pressed over here. Now, this can happen, forever if I don't tell it to actually stop counting. And so if, for example, I were to remove the stop counting over here and rerun this app, what we're going to see is when I start this guy, my mouse is up right now, right? Like I can click over here and we're counting away. We set the background color back to blue. That triggered a new start on this count over here. So we almost have a little stopwatch in a way. Remember that we were able to start our count. But there's something interesting that's happening here. Notice 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30. I'm going to press this again. Actually, I'm going to press it several times. And what we're going to see over here is that this guy is really incrementing quickly. And the reason we're counting up into the thousands, almost in a second, is that all of these runnables are being queued up, right? I have stop counting being called over here. We're at 3,000. So I'm never actually telling it to stop counting. I'm never telling the handler to remove the callbacks. And that's the stop counting method over here. We're at 15,000. And so what I needed to do, so the method that was called by the first button press over here, that start counting, this initial button press is still running. Like that loop, the self-referential loop, there are several of these self-referential loops running at the same time. And so the way to get rid of them is to make sure that you tell the handler to get rid of those. So I'll just Shift F10 to redeploy over here, and we'll see that this is now going to run only as long as my mouse is down. When I release, it's done. That's about it. Enjoy.